Do you believe in God, or are you only afraid of chaos? Freud did not see religion just as a belief, but as a collective psychological symptom. For him, faith in a supreme being was not a rational choice, but an unconscious necessity, a defense mechanism against the uncertainty of life. He was not interested in proving or refuting the existence of God. What he wanted to understand was, why do so many people believe? And the answer he found was not optimistic. According to Freud, the human being does not support the idea of being alone in an unpredictable universe. The world is cruel, death is inevitable, and suffering seems to have no sense. Given this, our mind seeks protection, and religion offers just that. But what if God is just a reflection of our own fear? Freud argued that religion was not born of reason, but from anguish. We believe not because we have proof, but because we need to believe it. Faith is a shield against the terror of existence, but does this emotional need make religion true, or just a comforting illusion? If Freud himself were here now, he would probably answer, religion is an illusion that depends on the human desire to be protected. And if he is right, what do we have left without her? Why do so many religions call God Father? For Freud, this was no coincidence. According to him, the belief in a higher being is born of our childish need for protection. As children, we are defenseless before the world and completely depend on our parents to survive. They impose rules, offer security, and above all give us the feeling that someone is taking care of everything. But as we grow up, this protection disappears. The real world is cruel, unpredictable, and indifferent. But instead of facing this new reality head-on, many people simply transfer this emotional dependence to God. Freud explains that religion is essentially the psychological projection of the father figure. God assumes the role of the idealized father, imposes rules, the commandments, sin, religious morals. It offers punishment, hell, karma, reincarnation as punishment, promises rewards, paradise, salvation, eternal life. Faith, then, would not be a rational act, but a reflection of the human fear of loneliness and uncertainty. Now think, if God were just a projection of our desire for security, would we still need him? Or is it time to mature and accept reality without this illusion? Freud did not see religion only as a system of beliefs. For him, organized, faith functioned as collective neurosis, something deeply rooted in the human psyche but which, deep down, limited our mental and emotional freedom. What does that mean? He compared religiosity to an obsessive-compulsive disorder. Just as someone with OCD develops rituals to relieve anxiety, how to wash their hands repeatedly or avoid stepping on certain lines on the floor, religions create rituals that help control fear and uncertainty. Freud believed that religious dogmas functioned as mechanisms of defense of the unconscious, as they prevented people from viewing the emptiness of existence. The primitive man, in the face of a chaotic and hostile world, invented rituals to feel in control. The problem is that this attempt to control has become a prison. The obsession with sin, guilt, and rituals is what makes religion, according to Freud, a form of neurosis. In other words, we believe to avoid the panic of doubt. But what happens when this belief does not free us, but imprisons us? Religion teaches that we must fear and obey. He says there are certain questions that should not be asked. It establishes absolute rules that must be followed without question. The believer is attached to a cycle where the fear of punishment and the hope of the reward guide his actions. Wouldn't that be a symptom of psychological conditioning? If faith really were a way to freedom, why does it require people to renounce their own autonomy? Freud believed that this compulsive structure of religion not only limited critical thinking, but also perpetuated anxiety. The believer follows the rituals to relieve guilt, but this guilt never disappears. The more he seeks purification, the more he feels he needs to purify himself. The cycle never ends. And the big question is, do we need this religious compulsion to live well? Or would it be possible to find meaning in life without this kind of collective neurosis? If religion imposes guilt, repression, and fear, then the next question is inevitable. What is the role of sin in the human psyche? Why do so many religions insist on the idea of sin? Freud believed that the concept of sin was not just a moral matter, but a psychological mechanism of social control. The guilt, he said, does not arise out of nowhere. It is implanted. From an early age, we are taught to fear divine punishment for thoughts or desires considered immoral. This repression creates a cycle where the individual feels constantly inappropriate, always failing to meet the demands of a God who sees everything. This keeps people in a state of internal surveillance, shaping behaviors not for reason, but for fear. Freud compared this to dynamics between parents and children. In childhood, the child learns to obey to avoid punishment. When it grows, this blind obedience transfers to invisible figures of authority: God, religious dogmas, unchanging moral laws. But this repression has a cost. Desire does not disappear, it is only pushed into the unconscious. The person keeps feeling angry, envy, sexual desire, but now experiences these feelings with guilt. The result? An endless internal conflict. In the Malaysian culture, Freud argues that civilization depends on the repression of instincts. Religion would have emerged precisely to channel these impulses, creating rules that guarantee the social order. But at the same time, this system generates suffering, as the individual never feels completely pure or free of guilt. And that is what makes religion such a powerful tool. There is no need to rigid external control if people already carry the weight of self-censorship within themselves. If God is always observing, then every thought must be policed. Each desire must be repressed, and obedience becomes automatic. The big question Freud asks us is, what happens to the human mind when we grow up under a system that teaches us to feel guilty about the simple fact that it exists? If religion were really a way for freedom, why does it impose this psychological burden? What if this burden was not a mistake, but one of the fundamental pillars of its existence? Religious repression not only limits the individual, but also structures the whole society. In the next topic, we will see how this influence extends beyond staff, shaping even the way entire cultures operate. Religion frees us or imprisons us? Freud believed that religion was not just an individual illusion, but a collective control structure. In the Malaysian culture, he argues that civilization only works because it imposes restrictions on human impulses, and religion plays a crucial role in this process. Since the early days of society, religious dogmas have been used to define what is allowed and what is prohibited. But unlike human laws, which can be questioned and reformulated, religious norms are presented as immutable and sacred. Obedience, then, is not just from external coercion, but from the belief that there is a supreme being judging every thought and action. This creates a powerful psychological effect. Control becomes internal. If people believe God sees everything and punishes sinners, they do not need police to be watched. They themselves watch themselves. And this is not restricted to behavior. Religion also regulates feelings and desires, establishing what is right even within the mind of each individual. For Freud, this system produces constant discomfort. The human being, naturally moved by desires and instincts, finds himself in an endless conflict between his wills and the rules imposed by faith. He cannot simply do what he wants, for he was taught to fear the spiritual consequences of his actions. Religion transforms natural impulses into guilt and anguish, and this continuous repression prevents the individual's psychological maturity. Instead of learning to deal with the reality of life, he takes refuge in the promise of a greater order and an absolute meaning. But what if this promise is just an illusion necessary to maintain social order? Freud saw religion as a tool that prevents people from developing really autonomous thinking. When everything has already been decreed by a higher entity, seeking the truth becomes an act of insubordination. Questioning dogmas is not just a philosophical exercise, it is a challenge to the very structure of society. If religion always presents itself as a path to virtue, Why so often it silences, oppresses, and limits? And most importantly, without religion, what would be left? If religious norms serve to give a greater meaning to life, the next question becomes inevitable. Do we really need God to find purpose? Freud believed that the human being has an almost desperate need for meaning. We live in an unpredictable world, marked by suffering, uncertainty, and death. And in view of this, religion emerges as a perfect answer. It offers a plan, an origin, a destination, and above all, a why. But for Freud, this answer is an illusion. Not in the vulgar sense of lies, but in the psychoanalytic sense, an unconscious desire designed in reality. That is, we do not believe in God because there is evidence of his existence. We believe why we need it to exist. Religion in this context is not born of reason, but of the emotional need to have something or someone that organizes chaos. And here is the most provocative point of Freudian criticism. We prefer the comfort of illusion to the weight of freedom. The promise that life has a superior purpose, that suffering will be rewarded, that there is a benevolent being ensuring us. All this relieves anguish, but also infantilizes us. For Freud, faith is not spiritual maturity, it is emotional regression. Like a child who needs his father to protect her from the dark, the believer needs God to protect him from emptiness. But this protection has a price. When we give the meaning of life to a divine authority, we give up our own ability to build it. Total freedom, that of creating their own values, defining one's morals and dealing with uncertainty without crutches and frightens. It is easier to believe that there is already a plan. It is easier to follow rules than to create yours. It is easier to believe that there is one why than accepting that perhaps there is no and that we should invent it. Freud did not propose to replace religion with another belief. He proposed something much harder, to face reality without masks. No dogmas, no promises, no guarantees. But are we ready for this? Do we have the strength to abandon the comfort of faith and fully assume the weight of freedom? This is what leads us to the last point. If there is no God, there is no destiny. And if there is no destiny, then we are responsible for everything. If God does not exist, or if we choose to live as if it did not exist, then all the certainties we inherit at once. Without heaven, no hell. Without divine purpose, without salvation. Only the human being remains, and with him, the total freedom. But this freedom, which at first glance it seems liberating, is a heavy burden. It requires that we take full responsibility for our choices, for our morals, for our mistakes. No excuses, no crutches, no guarantees. Freud saw in this freedom the true test of maturity. It does not take courage to obey imposed rules. It takes courage to build their own rules and bear the consequences. And perhaps that's why many prefer to cling to faith, not necessarily for rational conviction, but because it offers refuge against the terror of chaos. The idea that someone knows what they are doing, that there is a plan, that our suffering is not in vain, that in the end will make sense. But Freud invites us to reverse this logic. What if true growth is precisely to reject the comfort? And if you mature, it is accepting that life may not have a greater purpose and yet to choose to live it with intensity, responsibility, and lucidity? He does not propose destruction of faith by destruction. He proposes the liberation of dependence, the chance of living as conscious adults, not as eternal children waiting for salvation. This is the end point, and at the same time, the starting point. Live without guarantees. Create meaning where there is no. Act without appeal, no judge, no sky, no fear. Because perhaps the true meaning of life is not found. Maybe it needs to be built. And the question Freud leaves us is straightforward. Do you have the courage to live without absolute certainties? Or do you prefer the comfort of ready answers? This is the final provocation, and perhaps the most necessary. Freud proposes to us an uncomfortable idea. Perhaps faith in God is not a revealed truth, but an emotional necessity, a desire for comfort, a reflection of the fear we feel in the face of death, chaos, loneliness. But what if, when leaving faith behind, we are not losing ourselves, but finally maturing? That is the question that remains. There is no easy answer, just an invitation to assume freedom with everything it carries. And now I want to hear you. Do you agree with Freud? Is religion a comfortable prison or a deep expression of our human condition? Leave your comment below. Let's continue this debate with respect, courage, and critical thinking. If this video has teased you, it made you reflect. Share with those who need to hear that. Short, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This space only exists because you are here, and every restless new mind strengthens this journey. We see each other in the next video.